May 2nd, 1945, Berlin, the Reichskanzlei sector. The taste of concrete dust coated Wilhelm Monkke's throat as he pressed his back against the shattered wall. Above him, the vaulted ceiling of the Führerbunker trembled with each Soviet artillery impact, a rhythmic thunder that had become the heartbeat of his dying world. His right foot throbbed where it ended, where Yugoslavia had claimed 3 toes 4 years earlier. The phantom pain of missing flesh had become his constant companion, a reminder that he had given pieces of himself to this cause long before Berlin became a tomb. Through the smoke drifting down the corridor, he could see his men, boys really, most of them, gripping their weapons with hands that shook from exhaustion rather than fear. They had stopped being afraid days ago. Fear required the luxury of imagining a future. Mohnkė checked his watch. 1,400 hours. In 12 hours, he would attempt to lead what remained of his command through Soviet lines. In 12 hours, most of these boys would be dead. But for now, in this moment suspended between loyalty and oblivion, he was still SS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Monck, commander of the Citadel sector, defender of the Führer to the end. The irony would come later, much later, in a Soviet interrogation room, when his captors would save the life he'd been willing to sacrifice. 25 years earlier, Lübeck had been a different world. Wilhelm Monck came from working people. His father operated machinery in one of the Baltic port cities' factories, hands perpetually stained with grease, back bent from decades of labor that promised nothing except more labor. In 1920, when Wilhelm turned 20 years old, Germany was a nation on its knees, humiliated by Versailles, gutted by inflation, haunted by the ghosts of 2 million dead from the Great War. The National Socialist German Workers' Party offered something the Weimar Republic could not: certainty, purpose, the promise that strength could restore what weakness had lost. Mohnkė joined the NSDAP and the SS in 1931, when the organization was still small enough that every member mattered, intimate enough that loyalty was measured in personal devotion rather than bureaucratic compliance. Within months, his dedication elevated him into the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Führer's personal bodyguard unit. For a working-class boy from Lübeck, standing in the inner circle of power must have felt like destiny rewarding virtue. He believed. That belief would define everything that followed. The war began for Mohnkė on September 1st, 1939, when German forces crossed into Poland. He fought through the campaign with the methodical efficiency that would become his trademark. The Iron Cross he received was not for wild heroism, but for competent brutality, the kind of reliable violence upon which empires are built. But it was in the West, during the spring of 1940, that questions first began to surface. Questions that would follow Mohnkė like shadows for the rest of his life. Near Wormhout, France, in late May, approximately 80 British and French prisoners of war were murdered after surrendering. Mohnkė's unit was there. Witnesses would later testify to seeing SS soldiers forcing prisoners into a barn, throwing grenades inside, machine gunning those who tried to escape. The screams, they said, lasted for hours. Mohnkė denied direct involvement. No definitive proof ever materialized, but the accusation attached itself to his name like a stain that water couldn't wash away. A year later, in June 1941, similar accusations emerged from Normandy. Canadian prisoners executed after capture. Again, Mohnkė's command was implicated. Again, conclusive evidence remained elusive. The pattern suggested something darker than coincidence, but fell short of legal certainty. In the moral algebra of war, Mohnkė existed in a gray space, not proven innocent, never proven guilty, forever suspected. Yugoslavia, 1941. The Balkans campaign. The bullet that shattered Mohnkė's right foot came during combat operations in the rugged Yugoslav terrain. One moment he was advancing with his unit, the next he was on his back, looking up at a sky that seemed too blue for so much pain. The field hospital was chaos. Screaming men, the metallic smell of blood mixing with antiseptic. Doctors moving with the frantic efficiency of those who knew they could never save enough lives fast enough. Mohnkė's foot was ruined, bones fragmented, tissue destroyed. The surgeon, working by inadequate light with inadequate supplies, made the calculation: amputate 3 toes or risk losing the entire foot to infection. Mohnkė woke to a new reality. Permanently maimed, his days of frontline combat theoretically over. He refused to accept it. Through months of painful rehabilitation, he forced his mutilated foot to function. He learned to walk again, then to run, then to soldier. The limp remained subtle but permanent. So did the pain, a constant ache that worsened in cold weather, that throbbed with every long march. He never complained. Complaining would suggest weakness, and weakness was unthinkable. By 1942, he was back in command. The Eastern Front consumed men like firewood. Mohnkė watched the Wehrmacht's grand summer offensives of 1942 stall in the vastness of Russia. He witnessed the disaster of Stalingrad from a distance. 200,000 German soldiers encircled, starved, frozen, destroyed. The myth of invincibility died there, bleeding out in the snow. Still, Mohnkė's faith held. He believed in the Führer's vision with the kind of conviction that transcends evidence. When others began to whisper doubts, when rational officers started calculating the mathematical impossibility of German victory, Mohnkė remained a true believer. Perhaps his working-class origins made him more susceptible to the totalitarian promise. The idea that total commitment could achieve what partial effort could not. Or perhaps, having given so much already, he simply couldn't afford to doubt. To question would mean acknowledging that his sacrifices, his missing toes, his dead comrades, the potential war crimes shadowing his conscience, had been for nothing. Faith became his armor against despair. In January 1945, as the Red Army stood on German soil and Allied bombers reduced cities to rubble, Adolf Hitler promoted Mohnkė to SS Brigade Führer. It was a recognition of loyalty more than tactical genius, an acknowledgement that in the Reich's final hours, devotion mattered more than brilliance. Berlin, April 1945. The city was dying. Block by block, street by street, the Soviet forces ground forward. The Reichstag, the government quarter, the historic center, all became battlegrounds where German soldiers fought not for victory, but for the privilege of dying slowly rather than quickly. Mohnkė commanded the Citadel sector, the final defensive perimeter around the Reichskanzlei and the Führerbunker beneath it. His force consisted of approximately 2,000 men, a mixture of SS veterans, Wehrmacht soldiers, Volkssturm militia, ranging from 14-year-old boys to 60-year-old men, and even some Hitler youth who thought dying for the Führer was glorious rather than tragic. They faced nearly 2 million Soviet troops. The mathematics were obscene. The outcome was inevitable. But mathematics and outcomes weren't the point. The point was loyalty, demonstrated through willingness to stand in the path of history's oncoming tank. Mohnkė saw the Führer during those final days. Hitler, who had once seemed superhuman, had become a trembling old man, stooped, gray, his left hand shaking uncontrollably from Parkinson's disease or the cumulative weight of catastrophe. He pored over maps that showed armies that no longer existed, issued orders to units that had already been annihilated, raged against betrayals that were simply rational calculations by people who wanted to survive. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler killed himself. Mohnkė was there when the bodies were carried up to the Chancellery Garden. He watched as gasoline was poured over Hitler and Eva Braun. He stood as the flames consumed what remained of the man he'd devoted 15 years to protecting. What did he feel in that moment? Grief? Relief? The texts and testimonies remain silent on Mohnkė's interior life. Perhaps he felt nothing, just the same dull throb in his mutilated foot, the same metallic taste of concrete dust, the same waiting for the inevitable. May 1st. The breakout order came from Hitler's successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, attempt to escape Berlin. Mohnkė organized his remaining forces into 10 groups. The plan was desperate: move through the subway tunnels, surface beyond Soviet lines, somehow reach German forces still fighting in the West. It was, in essence, a suicide mission dressed in tactical language. They moved through the U-Bahn tunnels in darkness, hundreds of soldiers and civilians shuffling through flooded passages where the dead floated face down in the water. The air was thick with the smell of sewage and decomposition. Somewhere behind them, the sound of Soviet soldiers echoed through the tunnels. Shouts in Russian, the metallic click of weapons being readied. Mohnkė's group surfaced near the Weidendammer Bridge. Soviet forces were waiting, The firefight was brief and brutal. Monkke's position became untenable within minutes. Surrounded with ammunition running low and no possibility of reinforcement, the calculation changed from how to escape to how to surrender without being immediately executed. On May 2, 1945, SS Brigadeführer Wilhelm Monck raised his hands and walked into Soviet captivity. What happened next would shock him more than any bullet. The Soviet soldiers who captured Mohnkė didn't shoot him. They didn't beat him. Instead, they noticed his wound, his foot damaged from the old injury, now bleeding from the chaos of the breakout attempt. He was triaged, processed, and transported to a Soviet military hospital. There was no waiting line, no deliberate cruelty. The Soviet doctors operated on him immediately, cleaned the wound, prevented infection, stabilized his condition. They saved the life of an SS general who had spent years fighting to destroy their nation. Mohnkė, who had been taught that Soviets were subhuman barbarians, that communists were existential enemies deserving only extermination, found himself alive because those same enemies had provided medical care. His own side might not have managed in the chaos of collapse. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How does a true believer reconcile the humanity of those he's been taught to view as less than human? How does propaganda survive contact with contradictory reality? He was transferred to Moscow, to Lubyanka prison, the infamous headquarters of the NKVD, where interrogations were conducted with methods ranging from psychological pressure to physical torture. For 10 years, Wilhelm Monck lived in Soviet captivity, not in some labor camp in Siberia, but in Moscow, being questioned repeatedly about his wartime activities. The Soviets wanted information about the final days in the bunker, about war crimes, about the SS command structure, but they never formally charged him. Despite the accusations from Wormhout and Normandy, despite his proximity to Hitler, despite commanding SS forces throughout the war, the Soviets never put Mohnkė on trial. Why? Perhaps the evidence remained circumstantial. Perhaps they valued his intelligence more than his punishment. Perhaps in the calculus of Soviet justice during the early Cold War, an SS general who could provide detailed testimony about the Nazi regime's final moments was more useful alive and cooperative than dead or imprisoned indefinitely. 1955, West Germany. When the Soviets finally released Mohnkė, he returned to a nation that had spent a decade trying to forget what it had been. The Federal Republic of Germany was building a new identity, democratic, Western-aligned, determinedly non-confrontational about its immediate past. Mohnkė fit the pattern. He disappeared into private life. He went into business, became successful, purchased a comfortable home. When journalists occasionally sought him out, he declined interviews. When historians asked questions, he provided minimal answers. When Allied investigators reopened inquiries into the Wormhout and Normandy massacres, he maintained his denial of involvement. No charges were ever filed. The passage of time, the difficulty of gathering evidence decades after events, the political complications of prosecuting German nationals during the Cold War, all combined to create a space where Mohnkė could live quietly, neither vindicated nor condemned. He married, had a family, attended veterans gatherings where old SS men told each other that they'd only done their duty, that they'd been soldiers, not criminals, that history had judged them unfairly. Did he believe it? Did he ever lie awake at night, his ruined foot throbbing, thinking about the screaming prisoners in the barn near Wormhout? Did he remember the faces of the boys who died following his orders in Berlin? Did he wonder why Soviet doctors saved his life when he'd spent years trying to destroy theirs? The record is silent. Wilhelm Monck took his interior life to the grave. August 6, 2001, Hamburg, Germany. Wilhelm Monck died at age 90 years old, wealthy, unpunished, still controversial. His obituaries noted his role as one of Hitler's last defenders, but couldn't definitively answer the questions that had haunted his biography. War criminal or simply soldier? Guilty of massacres or merely present when others committed them? Fanatic or pragmatist? The ambiguity was, perhaps, the point. Monkke's life illustrated the uncomfortable reality that history is full of people who inhabit gray spaces, neither purely innocent nor conclusively guilty, neither entirely forthcoming nor wholly deceptive. He represented the thousands of men who made Nazi Germany function, who carried out its wars, who stood close enough to atrocities to smell the smoke, but maintained sufficient distance to claim plausible deniability. He also represented the limitations of justice. Despite investigations spanning decades, despite testimonies from survivors, despite documentary evidence of his command's activities, the legal system never definitively proved his guilt. Perhaps the evidence truly was insufficient, or perhaps the machinery of accountability simply moved too slowly, outlasted by the very people it sought to judge. The concrete dust has long since settled in Berlin. The Reichschancellery, where Mohnkė made his last stand, is gone. Demolished by the Soviets, paved over, replaced by apartment blocks where people who weren't born until decades after the war now raise children who know Hitler only as a lesson in history class. But the questions Mohnkė's life raises remain uncomfortably present. How much loyalty is too much? At what point does dedication become complicity? When a person commits their life to a cause that reveals itself as monstrous, do we judge them by their intentions or their impacts? And when the machinery of justice fails to provide definitive answers, how do we reconcile the human need for closure with the messy reality of historical ambiguity? Wilhelm Monck, the working-class boy from Lübeck who believed so completely that he stood in a bunker while the world burned, never answered these questions. He simply lived with them, his mutilated foot a permanent reminder that some wounds never fully heal, some debts never fully settle, some accounts never fully close. And perhaps that's the most honest epitaph, not a judgment, but an acknowledgement that some stories end without resolution, that history is full of men whose guilt or innocence remains forever suspended in the space between accusation and proof, between what we know and what we can prove, between the person they might have been and the person they chose to become.